Hello, I'm Susan King. I'm the Dean of the School of Journalism and Mass Communication here at UNC Chapel Hill, and I am with the deans, two deans, my predecessors. I'll introduce you first. Jean Folkerts, who was the dean here for 5 years at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and Nick Lemann, the last dean, not the current dean at Columbia School of Journalism in New York. Both Carnegie Knight deans and really top of the game, I think, in terms of deandom, and I'm happy to have you here. We want to talk about the book that you just brought out, Educating Journalists, A New Plea to the University Tradition. Nick, I'm going to start with you because Columbia got a grant from Carnegie Corporation in New York to really bring together some of the ideas about journalism revitalized, and particularly on the master's degree level, graduate studies level. And Jean is part of that. So give me the top level conclusions and challenge that you wanted to bring.
Well, so it turns out, when you talk about journalism school, people who aren't journalists and who don't work in journalism school hear that as being sort of like med school or law school or business school. And what they don't know is that of the people who are officially enrolled in journalism school, first of all, the overwhelming majority are undergraduates. And second of all, the majority, heavy majority, are not planning to be journalists. They're in other communications fields. So what people think of, what springs to mind when you hear the term journalism school, which is a master's degree, for a professional master's degree to become a journalist, is actually a very tiny field. And one of the things that we've been trying to do is draw more attention to it and say, for journalism education to reach its full potential, both within the university and outside the university, it needs to emphasize these professional master's degrees more and think of them as a separate thing that is different from the undergraduate degree. So we try to explain in this report how the situation where the professional master's degree is so tiny a part of what we do came into being. That's Jean's piece. And then all of us talking about what we think they should be.
And Jean, I want you to bring that perspective of having led a great journalism school, but also looking at the history. Tensions about a high-quality university degree in journalism has existed throughout history.
It's always been a major point of discussion amongst professional journalists and amongst academics. And early on, the big debate was about whether journalists needed a college education at all, or whether you could just simply learn it in the newsroom. And then the second debate was about whether it should be a liberal arts education or whether it ought to be more professional journalism training. And the American Society of Newspaper Editors was heavily involved in the discussion from 1900 on. Had a lot to say about it, had committees every year, and were angry at the deans a number of times. Always the tension between professional versus academic. And then when social sciences developed in the mid-40s, that brought a new sort of dimension to the argument, because a lot of people who were involved in journalism schools really embraced the new social science research, particularly with the advent of radio and then television. And professional journalists were not so accepting of that approach. So I think that it's always been a tension, and the tension sort of balances one direction or another depending on the year, and also depending a little bit on what state journalism is in. And when journalism is in a state of uproar or a state of chaos or a state of change,
Today,
the challenges to journalism schools are sort of more vocal on the part of professional journalists. Yeah. And I remember some years ago when there were a few ethics scandals, the blowing up of the truck and some of those famous ethics scandals, there was a big attack on journalism schools for not teaching ethics. So the sort of rhetoric often follows what's happening in the industry at large.
But I want to just follow on that, because there's something to say about that for most journalists is powerfully counterintuitive. So everybody says journalism is in an uproar, the digital revolution is going on, so journalism schools should stop what they're doing and only teach digital journalism skills, because that's obviously what needs to happen now. We all do teach digital journalism skills, so I don't want to make it sound like I'm saying we should just teach print journalism skills. But actually, The way to get the most value and to realize the full potential of a professional school is not to do exactly what's happening at that moment in the profession. You're training people in a way that should stay with them for decades, and it sounds smart to be right on what's going on at the exact moment in the field. It's actually not that smart. It's not the way to leverage the advantage of being in a university, and it's not the way to serve your students well. You should be able to teach people things that are going to last past the current trend.
So those are things like thinking critically, right? Being able to write on any medium, and what
also
else?
to create leadership. I think the idea is to have a master's program, a graduate program, in which people think ahead of the industry. If you're just scrambling to teach digital skills, you're trying to catch up with what the industry is trying to catch up with. You should already be doing that in many of the prominent schools we are, and have been for quite a while. But what you're trying to do is get people to think ahead of that. What's going to come next? What's coming after the digital revolution, and what do we need to be prepared for? And how do we think about the importance of journalism in a democratic society and that role? We don't want to lose sight of that role in just focusing on digital skills, because that's the critical role, I think, for journalists in a society.
Yeah, and just amen, sister, and as we say in the South, and I would just add a couple points to that. Just this is really echoing what Jean said. At this moment in particular, the field is looking to the schools for leadership, if the schools can provide it.
And that's a change, right?
That's a change. As you know, the tradition, as Jean showed in her research, is the schools look to the industry for leadership. The industry sort of, in overstating slightly, tells the schools what to do, and the schools say yes, sir, and do it. It's on us, both in the sense of developing new ways to present and do journalism, and contexts, economic context, social context, etc., for journalism. It's on us to be in the conversation and to try to lead, because there isn't a lot of room for leadership when things are so desperate out there for a lot of the news organizations. The other thing that I'd say about what do we do, in answer to your other question, journalists have an impossible but a wonderfully impossible job, which is you have to try to figure out the truth of complicated situations very quickly, and then once you figure them out, communicate it to the general public, not to experts. That's what we teach people how to do. That can be done.
Say that again. The truth, that's a great phrase. The truth of...
The truth, we need to determine the truth of complicated subjects quickly, and then communicate what we found in a way that's understandable to the general public. And it's a wonderful mission to execute. It's fun. It's hard, but it's fun. It's a very socially useful mission because it generates a democracy that works. But that's what we teach people how to do. Now, that doesn't mean we don't teach them how to do it on digital platforms, but you know, if you say our whole curriculum is how to have a personal Twitter strategy or how to write for mobile platforms, that doesn't capture the larger mission of what journalists do.
And what about the line, the crooked line? Because if there aren't journalist jobs, and lots of people are always looking for a degree to get them a job, there's a more complicated world, and it seems to me more need for communication. And it may not be a strictly journalism job, but it might be in a science organization. The truth still matters to people. So where does that play in this idea of a master's
Well, the lines
degree?
are blurring quickly because a lot of people who didn't do news are thinking about doing news. To pick up on the example you mentioned, the Yale School of Forest Management has this wonderful thing they started called Yale Environment 360, which is an online environmental news site started by a non-journalistic organization employing journalists. NRDC has a magazine and a site called On Earth, Natural Resources Defense Council. They're all over the place. Human rights organizations have them. Hospitals have them, and medical schools have them. So there's the traditional news world, and then there's a million new players.
And they all need what we do, right?
They all need what we do, and a lot of the NGOs, and a lot of those magazines were around in magazine format before, and they've shifted to an online format. but there are still many, many outlets out there that need really good, trustworthy reporting.
So will people think if it's a master's degree in journalism, it's too limiting and they won't see themselves in it, or these organizations won't see our graduates in it, or do we have to be...
I think our students see themselves in that wider world. I think it's the professors who more often see the worlds as narrower worlds and more segmented. But younger people see it much more in a much more fluid fashion, I think, than we do.
But what I would say is there is a difference that's meaningful, at least to me, on if you're communicating, are you communicating a directed conclusion or an independently derived conclusion? And what I think distinguishes journalism is the idea that your job, going back to what I was saying before, is to get to the truth of the situation, the best you can do with it, not to know what you're going to find before you find it. Within that,
I've been
though,
both sides of the question, though, and sometimes when I was in an organization, I had more room for the truth than I did when I had an editor telling me the conclusion.
Fair.
So
Life is imperfect, but nonetheless, if you're a journalism school, what you're turning out is people who are very good at assimilating a lot of information quickly, and being more affirmative about getting it, like interviewing and that sort of thing, and then pulling it all together, assessing it, and giving a result. That's a very useful skill in the whole world, not just in news organizations.
my gut tells me, and that's why I'm so interested in this report, that at this complicated moment in our country, with so much change going on, not only in the news business, higher education, and in so many different ones, that a master's degree, a leadership sort of vision, you know, in a university setting is needed now more than ever. But it's expensive, and people are afraid to put money down. And what's the return on their investment in terms of their careers? As you looked at this, do you really feel this is a growth area? Maybe not this year, but in the next decade?
Well, you got to have some vision and hope. As you know, as a dean, because you have to figure out how to pay for it, there are realms of leadership level education, particularly in academic PhD programs, where the universities and funders essentially say, we think this is so important that we're going to step up to the plate and pay for it and make the market question substantially go away. And, you know, a lot of the way to make this work can be fundraising. And it's money very well invested by the funders, I think, in the difference it makes. I also think that over time, the news business is going to sort of shake out, and the sort of commodity journalism, as I would call it, is going to lose all of its economic value. Very straightforward, just the facts of something. And value-added journalism is what's going to have economic value, and that'll push in the direction of a better education. So instead of having a sort of quasi, you know, almost upper blue-collar field, you'd have a mass working essentially for free as bloggers and so on, and then a smaller group paid more with higher status, higher skills. That would be my hopeful vision.
Who bring real value to the news or the information out there.
And those, I think, are the people who really benefit from a master's degree and focusing on a graduate education. That will be the sort of leadership of the future.
On all fronts. So the last question I want you both to just take is, we do talk, amen, sister, about the role of journalism in a democracy. And that's the one shift. You can be a great leader doing complicated information at a hospital or a museum or a human rights organization, but you don't have that democratic mission behind you. So what's that mean at this moment?
Well, I think at this moment it's as important as it always was, and it takes on different forms in different periods. I always tell my students, when they look at the old partisan journalism in early days, and they see it kind of negatively, I say these were people who were building a nation, and so politicians and journalists may have been working together more closely, but it's because they were building a nation. So you look at what is happening right now and what people are trying to build right now and what the shape of the country is and what the direction of it is. And then you look at how the journalist role sort of enacts itself in that milieu.
Last word?
You know, democracy is chaotic, right? You can't determine the outcomes. There's a lot of information out there. some elections, by my lights, have good results, some elections have bad results. But you have to believe that better quality information makes a democracy work better. And it doesn't get produced automatically. It doesn't get crowdsourced, particularly when journalists are going out and actually developing new information by unearthing things that weren't unearthed, by interviewing people, by going on site. That adds value to a society in ways that you can't always measure, in the same way that a public library does. And as, it's vitally important for the United States to have that, and we should make sure at this moment of challenge that we realize how important it is.
When we started the Carnegie Initiative, I remember that Vartan said there were 3 important groups of people: librarians, teachers, and journalists. And so I think that sums up what Nick was saying a little bit.
Absolutely. So Jean Folkerts, Nick Lemann, 2 former deans from a new dean. Thank you for this report. Educating journalists, a new plea for the university tradition. I hope it's talked about in journalism schools across the country. Thanks.
Thank you.